Hello and welcome to the Rover Media's podcast network, The Midnight Choir. We appreciate all your support and we ask you to go check out the work that we do over in the link below, therover.ca/support-us or therover.ca/newsletter. You can check out all the writing that we're doing over there and all the extreme deep dive reporting that we are giving. Investigative journalism at its finest. Trans rights are a hotly debated, fiery issue today. I wanted to talk to an expert from the community on the subject to find out if what's being said is accurate, or if it's an alarmism coming from certain angles. What does the future look like for trans people in Quebec? What is it like now? I called up Rover Correspondent Celeste, and we talked through her thoughts and research. Although I did not agree with many of the things that she said, it was still interesting to hear from her perspective all the things that were happening. I myself have been part of the trans community for many years as somebody who's non-binary and always fighting for the rights of those who are LGBTQ, and so it was interesting having a discussion with someone who is in my camp, but whom I did not agree with in every way.
Sure, so I'm Celeste, she, her pronouns. I'm a trans activist and jurist based here in Joggy, colonially known as Montreal. I do a lot of work with regards to the trans community here, or that be through, legal work, like, for example, folks' access name changes, helping folks with various access justice needs, as well as, just street level advocacy. Because unfortunately, that remains still very much an urgent need for so many folks in the community. And sometimes, when nobody will listen, going down onto the streets is your only choice.
Yeah, what you said you help for like advocacy. Is there? Do you have like a degree in something like law or something like that? Is that what you mean by that?
I'm currently working on it.
Oh, that's amazing. Where are you studying?
Université Montréal.
Okay, that's incredible. You're planning to practice here in Quebec then? Are you from Quebec?
Yeah, I'm a local.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm from Vancouver, so it's really great meeting people who are trying to just fight for the community here in Quebec. I love seeing that.
Yeah, there's so many more folks in BC, but it's very much not the case here. It's empty. It's a desert.
It's crazy because I'd say Montreal and Vancouver are sort of the capitals of LGBTQ world in Canada, probably. Maybe Toronto.
Yeah.
I guess Toronto because it's huge, but I think Vancouver and Montreal more.
Absolutely.
And I just it's really interesting coming here because you're a francophone, right?
Yeah.
Which is really interesting because I find the queer community, and I'm super involved in the queer community myself, it tends to be mostly Anglophones.
It's owing to, I'd say, international culture. It does not come alone.
Yeah.
And we're talking about, queerness here. It hinges so much on a very globalized culture that is very much, US centric. I mean, here in Quebec, we're trying to set ourselves apart, and I mean, there are efforts being put on board in order to create like a brand new, more distinctive, francophone queer, culture. But it remains something that exists both within the paradigm of colonialism, as well as in the shadows of a broader internationalized Anglophone culture.
Because what do you mean we're trying to create a distinct francophone queer culture? Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so by that I mean that there is so much of a just a broader queer community which has always been centered around the same ideas. So I'm sure for example, just the whole mainstream paradigm around like things start with Stonewall and like slowly evolved in this very like Americanized model of LGBT rights in general, whereas the T was not even a big thing, at least in the public eye, up to very recently. That's very much an Americanized model, which exists, within this very white colonial paradigm. Whilst, here in Quebec, of course, like we're trying to, a lot of folks want something that's more homegrown, that's more local.
Yeah.
And we do have our queer history to build ourselves off of, but it remains that this is a history that is both, hardly documented and also very much rooted in like many of those same colonial values.
Can you tell me more what you mean by those colonial values, just so we have a deeper context and better understanding?
I mean, I can talk a lot about just how white local queer community is.
Please, I would love to hear about that.
And that is a huge issue here, in fact, because it's so easy just to think of how community, I mean, we just pretend that it's colorblind, but in fact, it's very much a white-centered community here.
Yeah.
We're talking about, folks who are trying to work within like this French Canadian culture, yet very much still, go with a lot of these colonizer values. They only think of themselves. They don't, think of anyone who's like, say, non-white and wishes to take part in these movements. They don't really consider, the global perspectives on anything really. I'd say so often Quebec loves pretending to be one of the most progressive places in the world, and that is one heck of an issue.
It's interesting. We have a lot in common with Europe, which I think we could describe as fiscally progressive and socially conservative.
In many ways, I'd say to some degree so. For I'd say even fiscally here,
Mm.
the government does lean quite rightwards, as we can see with austerity measures everywhere.
Can you give me a little overview of the current state of transgender rights and visibility in Canada?
Sure. So across Canada, let's say things are going quite badly because what we're seeing right now is a paradigm in which people's rights are being increasingly under attack. And we also live in a world where more and more often people are willing to completely disregard human rights and a lot of, what what we've had to historically stand for the last like 50 plus years. I was just completely throwing that out of the door. So we're seeing that with how, for example, Saskatchewan is using the notwithstanding clause in order to further marginalize trans youth
Mm.
in school, which is unfortunately something which very much is being repeated, like including here with, for example, Bill 21. So this has very much been a very big issue locally. And I will say, it's everything's interconnected. And a lot of this global backlash against trans rights exists within the context of global rising fascism, as we're seeing with far right governments taking over more and more and more, with countries such as Italy, such as Sweden, as well as like jurisdictions such as Alberta, very much wanting to dig into a far right voter base, but at the cost of human lives. We're
Yeah.
seeing anti-trans legislation being put forward in, I mean, so far only Saskatchewan has implemented anti-trans laws properly said, but New Brunswick has also implemented anti-trans policies. Policies have now been imposed on school boards, and Alberta is planning to do the same and also restrict trans healthcare for trans youth, which has been proven time and time again to be life-saving.
At the same time, we're seeing some movements, like on the federal government, Bill C-16, changing aspects of Canadian law to acknowledge LGBTQ people in equality. How do you feel about that?
It may be an acknowledgement, but does it
Mm-hmm.
have a concrete impact on people's lives?
Right.
Honestly, I'd argue not.
Okay.
And we're
Why would
seeing
you
that
argue
with, for
not?
example, yeah, like if you're wondering, so much of anti-trans marginalization comes with with governments pretending that trans people have equal access to like say the courts and other institutions which are supposedly meant to protect them. But unfortunately, that is not the case. What do you think when police officers and when people who are supposedly in these positions of authority and who are supposedly in positions where they're here supposed to defend everyone are instead the ones targeting trans people? What if trans people continue to get misgendered in court every day and are unable to have even their basic human rights valued at the very institutions meant to protect them? What about, socioeconomic marginalization? What if someone is unable to earn more than like 20 or 30 grand a year because they're forced to work a minimum wage job because what they studied for in university, in their field, they don't hire trans people? That is
Hmm.
unfortunately things which I hear all the time. And that's
Yeah.
something that Bill C-16 can quash single-handedly? No. Is that something that, a conversion therapy ban, even despite how it can have a pretty strong symbolic power, would that fix everything? Not at all.
Hmm.
And there still are institutions practicing conversion therapy in Quebec as of 2023. Not sure about this year, but yeah, it's recent.
Were they shut down
So
as of last year?
I'm not sure, but there was an investigation last year conducted by Metro before they shut down,
Ah,
which found that there were conversion therapy sites
okay.
still being offered in rural Quebec and which remain active at the moment of publication of said article.
Do you find um, the difference between rural settings and city settings? Do you think it really is significantly safer in a city setting, or do you think it is sort of just perceived to be safer?
I'd say in a way it is safer, but primarily because there is community in cities, which
Right.
oftentimes is lacking in rural areas. That is why a lot of you see oftentimes trans people congregating into the same cities time and time again. That's why you have people, for example, my, you have these patterns of migration within trans community, whether that be from rural areas to like say larger larger parts of town, like for example, places like rural Quebec, they might move to Quebec City and South Carolina to Montreal, folks in Atlantic Canada moving from like say rural New Brunswick all the way to Halifax because that's a regional center. Folks moving from like Saskatchewan, say all the way to Vancouver because it's safer there.
Mm.
These patterns of migration remain time and time again way too common. And we're even seeing it at an international level, with folks from the US attempting to permanently settle up north of the border because it's just not safe for them down
You can't
south.
blame them. You can't blame them.
You can't. I mean, there have been people who filed refugee claims, like US citizens filing refugee claims
Mm.
across so-called Canada because they were persecuted owing to their transness in the US.
So the way I've seen the political discourse become is very violent, especially specifically in the States and out west in Canada, Alberta, Saskatchewan. The way people
Mhm.
talk about trans people is extremely reductive. It's dehumanizing. I would probably say. Um,
Exactly.
how do you feel that has affected the community?
They hurt so many people. I but I mean I know of at least like a good few suicides which have happened because so many trans folk just could not take it anymore. And this unfortunately is only bound to happen more and more as we see more and more governments progressively take action in order to further curtail the rights of especially trans people. This is really scary because we're seeing the issue here. We're
Mm-hmm.
seeing, why we're seeing that people are just feeling deeply unsafe. People not knowing what to do. People feeling hopeless. It's had a very personal impact on practically all of the trans people that I know of. And that shouldn't be the case. It really shouldn't be like this. But that is exactly what we're seeing.
With the potential and probable ascendancy of another conservative government, whether majority or minority, how do you feel that will affect trans rights in Canada?
It could potentially devastate everything.
Mm.
It very much could. We're seeing more and more the use of like attempts by politicians to bypass, for example, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in order to purposely attack trans people for political gain. And unfortunately, the very theory of, using the notwithstanding clause is true politically unpopular. Like that very theory, which was created in the late 1970s and early 1980s, no longer is applicable because of how much trans people have been dehumanized to the point where attacking them further could actually make you gain more votes. It's ridiculous. But that is where we are right now. And I
Would
will
you?
say it. It could I don't want to have to believe in a worst case scenario, but at this rate, there is very much a possibility that Canada could end up becoming a refugee producing country, as in forcing people to flee away from here because it simply just isn't safe to live here as a trans person. I do believe that that can happen.
What kind of scenario would it take for that to happen? Because that seems pretty unlikely.
It takes legislation which outright criminalizes trans life.
Right.
Let's say that is going to take, that is going to take people who are very much it's gonna take people who it's gonna take legislation which outright prevents trans people, like for example, whether that be youth or adults from accessing healthcare, or otherwise just imposing measures on them which would outright prevent them from living here.
Hmm.
It could be measures, for example, that completely ban, legal gender recognition, or like measures which purposely, push trans people into jails for being themselves. It could be a bathroom ban. It could be things like that. It's like I very much foresee if there is a criminal bathroom ban, then that could very much be the thing which sparks a refugee crisis.
Do you really think that that would happen? I mean, even in conservative Alberta, the most they've done is taken it away from rights for minors to transition. They it doesn't even seem to be on the table for above 18 to
I
take
mean,
away
it
rights from
could.
people above 18. Do you really think that's likely?
In Florida, there's anti-trans legislation which outright, if you use the correct bathroom, quote unquote. No, I'll just say if you use the correct bathroom in a public institution. So, for example, whether that be an airport, a college, etc., a lot of these places, that is going to be if you dare to if you even attempt to use one of those places, like for example, the airport bathroom, a college bathroom, or any public institution, any building, you're asked to leave because someone suspects you to be trans and you refuse to comply. That's a misdemeanor that could throw you for 1 year in prison just for using the correct bathroom.
Mm. And
People
that
have already been, yeah, it is literally criminalization of trans livelihoods.
yeah.
Period.
So when you're seeking trans healthcare, so you're thinking about transitioning and you need healthcare to support you, what does that look like for somebody
You're referring to it here or
here
elsewhere?
in Canada? Yeah, trying to stick to Canada mostly.
I'll probably talk more about Quebec because, like, trans healthcare,
Makes
unfortunately,
sense.
accessing it is very,
Hmm.
very province dependent because of how healthcare systems are managed at the provincial level. But here in Quebec, for example, you need to first, generally speaking, the process is first you need to get yourself like a letter, confirming like a gender dysphoria diagnosis from like a psychologist or another, mental health professional. But those are already so hard to find to the point where you will need
Yeah.
to go out of your way to you go out of your way and find yourself like a private psychologist that's
Hmm.
on one of, many different community curated lists. That's gonna cost you quite a bit of money.
Hmm.
After
Hmm.
that,
That's a
you consult a
huge
GP.
fund.
Yeah, after that, you consult your GP if you're lucky enough to have one, or you try to find your way into a walk-in clinic and ask for a referral to an endocrinologist. Usually, it's them who end up prescribing hormone therapy, and that already can be another like 6 months, 12 months, etc. Afterwards, you get your referral, you wait, then you're put, you're added to one of the set endocrinologist clients. Then from there, you can actually start the endocrinologist could then prescribe you hormone therapy.
Mm.
That's the usual process, but it can easily take 12 to 24 months.
Right. Right.
I mean, there are some GPs who prescribe much quicker, especially if you're willing to go for private healthcare. And unfortunately, that is a
Right.
reality which very much is present just in general. But
Right.
when it comes to trans healthcare, it's even more so. And I believe there's one or two practitioners here who do private healthcare, and like with them, you could probably get it in a much shorter amount of time. But with this, once again, not everyone can afford it.
How can you tell me a little bit about the mental health stats of trans folks in Canada?
Oh, it's pretty bad. I
Hmm.
don't have the exact statistics on me right now, but it's common knowledge, at least within the community, that most trans people's mental health would be on a scale of like poor to like good or excellent, generally speaking, be at poor or fair. So that is where a lot of trans people's mental health is. And once again, research has found time and time again that poor mental health outcomes in trans people, and this is at a global level, is not caused by the fact of being trans, but is caused almost entirely by anti-trans discrimination.
And this discrimination, like, is actively and in person, not just we're not just talking about political discrimination. We're talking about in face to face.
Indeed, at all levels of society, whether that be just face to face, casually everywhere, whether it be simple cases of denial of service, whether it be defamation, whether it be like being refused a job or like being fired from your job, all that. There are so many different examples of age-based discrimination in trans people's lives.
And what is, let's say someone who's trans is listening to this podcast right now, what sort of social services exist in Quebec and in Canada that they could seek for help?
I'd say most unfortunately with how social services have been to such a degree privatized, especially when it comes to community services.
Mm-hmm.
Usually you're going to have to look for different community organizations. Here in Quebec, I mean, there are a few community organizations who are doing the amazing work that's necessary for folks. There are a lot of like province-wide organizations, like for example, I know Trans Quebec, which offers, which has their like discussion groups, including for older trans folk who need like a community. There is in Montreal, there's Jeunesse Lambda, which offers support for gender diverse, and also just queer in general, youth age 14 to 29. So it's, I believe, 30 even. So it's quite a large age range, and they offer a lot of different services. If folks have legal needs, of course, there's my organization, Gérer Trans, which offers, free support with the gender market changes, amongst other things. And apart from that, I'd say we're lucky that the funding model here allows for rural and more remote organizations to also thrive. So you'll find a lot of those in like smaller cities, like for example, Transistrie in the eastern townships in the broader Sherbrooke region.
Great, that's really good to hear.
That way on the Gatineau side of the Ottawa-Gatineau border. There are a lot of these like smaller regional organizations which are also doing amazing work in their respective communities.
That's amazing. I'm really glad to hear that there's like some systems in smaller settings, because
exactly, it's something that's very lacking.
It's hugely lacking because there's not the community. It does exist in those communities, in those small cities, but it's hard for them to band together, especially considering a lot of the time there's so many social there's so many social challenges for people to gather in a community that is a rural setting or something like that. So yeah, I'm really glad to hear that there's some supports in smaller towns.
Honestly, me too. And a lot of these organizations actually only started sprouting in the last 5 years or so.
Cool. Great work, everyone. Keep it up, everyone out there. Keep fighting the fight. That's awesome to hear.
Yeah.
Celeste, can you tell me, please, maybe from your experience or from what you've read and researched, how do doctors treat trans people when they're trying to transition?
It depends, but I'd say a lot of the time it's just sheer denial. And doctors, effectively patronizing their patients and saying that that they're better without transitioning, etc.
Right.
It's unfortunate scenarios I hear way too often. I mean, even here we have like a few doctors who are actively anti-trans, who like and actively seek to undermine access to gender affirming care. But fortunately, they're few and far in between. But it remains that there are a lot of doctors who continue to refuse to prescribe hormone therapy, amongst other things, despite the fact that that is very much something which could be GPable.
Yeah, isn't that illegal to deny that?
Well, technically, you're supposed to refer to someone else, but
okay,
in practice, it's rare that I actually see that happen.
Right. Okay, and there's probably not a lot of like leeway or legal things that somebody who's seeking that care has access to or capability to do to actually respond.
I mean, you could sue, but is that something that everyone can afford?
Oh yeah, we're talking about a very poor community trying to throw down money to sue a rich doctor.
Indeed, and let's remember that doctors, they're all well insured and all that.
Oh, so well insured.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, that's a tough sell right there, to try and take a doctor to court about something like that when you're in one of the poorest and like kind of minority communities in the world. You know, it's so funny, Celeste. I bet you have this experience too, but you're smarter than me. But because I've been in the trans community and the queer communities my entire life, in my head I'm like, oh yeah, they're everywhere. But then I talk to like somebody who's not in the community, and my mind is, and they have no friends who are trans or queer, and it blows my tiny little mind, because I'm like, but there's so many. But statistically there's not so many, which is what blows my
Yeah,
mind.
I'd say a big thing when it comes to that phenomenon is the fact that so many queer and trans folk, they just exist in like a they build networks with each other. They
Hmm.
build connections with each other,
Yeah.
and it happens pretty rarely that folks from outside those circles end up,
Yeah.
entering within, queer and trans spheres because of how, these spheres oftentimes trans people have, had to live fairly insular lives because of
Yeah.
this sheer discrimination.
Yeah, it's such an interesting phenomena when you are in a community, so you don't notice the reality of the stats. Because I think I did research before this. I believe it's 0.25% of Canada that is trans, which is
Yeah, I mean, 1 in
so
200,
few.
I think with some, younger demographics closer to 1 in 100, but it remains that we're still pretty far and few in between. And
Yeah,
I'd say, I don't think the number of trans people in society will ever go past a certain percentage, just like how, lefties have always been about a certain percentage of society as well.
right, right. Yeah, yeah. And then most people are kind of more centristy, and then yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's hard to get outside of your bubble when you exist in a community like that.
Indeed. And I
Yeah.
mean, oftentimes it's because of safety, for obvious reasons.
Yeah, of course, because you feel safe and supported in your community, and people discuss and support each other, listen to each other, and you develop kind of this culture in the trans community. I find we have a very good culture of listening to each other's feelings and where we're at,
Indeed.
and so it always surprises me when I meet people who are like, "Oh, no one has ever listened to me," and I'm like, "Huh?
Indeed.
Really?"
Absolutely.
Celeste, how do you feel mainstream Canadian society is doing with accepting transgender people?
Honestly, it's getting worse.
Interesting.
And we're seeing that with numbers. We're seeing that with, how things have been evolving for the last a while. It's that so many trans folk have, just been relentlessly targeted by the media. And like media has also been responsible in a good way for creating the consent that is necessary in order to attack, in order to further justify attacks on trans people. Something like, for example, the triple stabbing at the University of Waterloo last year could never have happened unless, global media especially, I'd say, has sufficiently managed to dehumanize trans people to the point where attacking them without any impunity
Hmm.
becomes normalized. And that's something we're seeing too with, just individual attacks on trans people and in particular racialized trans women, as we're seeing with so many of the anti-trans murders that are being documented in the United States.
How would you respond to the common criticism? And we did discuss it a little bit, but the common criticism from the right is, oh, this is just a white person leftist phenomena.
Oh, it absolutely is. I'll have to address white and leftist in
Please,
in two different
please.
ways.
Yes.
First and foremost, transness is not just a white phenomenon. I
Mhm.
think that is something which a lot of white trans people have actually failed to realize themselves.
Right.
It's something that's been it's something that's been just seen so often is that how white trans people have oftentimes tried to seek refuge in like some sort of homo nationalism, which ultimately does not protect them nor anyone else in society. There are trans people in so many different parts of the world. It's you know there are there are pride festivals and attempts to put up pride festivals not only in the global north but also all across the global majority. And we're seeing that too with how so many trans people, seek to flee from countries that are unsafe for them. It's because they have to. Trans people exist everywhere, and they're gonna sprout up everywhere. It's not something which can be avoided, and
Mm.
that's something which we cannot just deny. So yeah, that's honestly a failing of the community that has to be addressed by the community, and that that media etc. just simply cannot ignore anymore because trans people of color, black trans people, indigenous trans folks, they have all existed for
Hmm.
for time immemorial. And even though the conception of transness differs a lot depending on different societies, different cultures, etc., it remains that they exist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to people's claim that, all trans folks are lefties, I mean, it's not exactly the case, but I will say that the trans community skews very heavily towards the left. I mean, it's obvious why. We see how the right wing is attempting to murder trans people over and over and over again. It's obvious why trans people have to take part in progressive social movements.
Mm-hmm.
It's because it's a question of life or death for them.
Right. Right. Why would you join a social movement on the right when they hate you?
Exactly.
That's very interesting. Yeah. There's pretty much a 0% chance that somebody on who's trans is going to wind up conservative. Although I have met people who have some pretty conservative opinions, which it surprises me, but it's okay. Like, they're allowed to have whatever
Mhm.
opinions they want, but it does surprise me a little bit sometimes. But people are diverse and impossible to put into a bubble. So
Indeed.
yeah. How can media do a better job fighting for transgender rights?
I'd say the big thing is to no longer fall for the two sides Kool-Aid. I'm
Hmm.
gonna say it. If the two different positions that are presented to you is trans people exist and to live safely, and the other position you have is trans people do not exist and should all be exterminated. Why would mainstream media continue to platform both of those voices and make comparisons between them as if it was legitimate? And why
Hmm.
does media continue to give attention to manufactured hate as it has for the last 10, 15 years? We've seen the pattern time and time again with things such as Gamergate in the United States, all the way to, like the the contemporary anti-trans movement here. We're seeing how media, just artificially creates consent for hate by, purposely platforming anti-trans voices or otherwise puppeting them. I've been like I've been personally defamed by numerous far-right media outlets before, and
Yeah.
I mean, why would mainstream media ever, puppet their voices or lend more credibility to them? You're only lending more credibility to hate, and that is unacceptable.
Hmm. Hmm.
Media needs to learn that if the two positions being presented to you is one is reasonable and the other is not, you cannot just keep on presenting both of them the same way or make a comparison between them. It's like if you're comparing the Earth is round and the Earth is flat. Only one is correct.
Hmm.
And that's something which, honestly, something needs to shift on that end.
Now, the mainstream media argument against you would be we have to be fair and balanced and understand that we have to reasonably weigh in on every side of an argument. How would you
I
respond to
mean,
that argument?
if if reasonable means siding with people who want to murder you, then that is by definition not reasonable.
Hmm. So do you think using language, because in the mainstream media, whenever I read an article and they discuss trans issues, they say the trans question is, I believe, the common term, the trans question, and you're like, the trans question, what is the question?
There's none. And media needs to also use accurate language as well.
Mm,
We cannot just keep on pretending that trans people just simply do not exist,
mm,
letting, or otherwise even using terms that are used by, by foreign actors in order to further dehumanize trans people.
mhm.
We're seeing that with, for example, the term "quote unquote" gender ideology, which has effectively
Right.
become the far right's favorite term
Yes,
that's
they love
being
that
used
term.
almost exclusively to demonize trans people or
Hmm.
otherwise, purposely try to separate the person from trans people
Hmm.
in order to justify vilifying and dehumanizing attacks.
Right, because you've diminished a person's humanity to an ideology.
Exactly. I mean, it is of a lot effective, you know. So
If we
not just
let
keep on pretending that this happens in a void because media can't create consent for hate.
imagine if instead of saying black people, they said black ideology.
It sounds
Jesus
ridiculous.
Christ.
It sounds ridiculous, and it's because it is.
That's nuts. Oh man, people would flip a wig. Oh my god. Uh okay. Sorry. That was just a wild thought. Just thinking of like the language cuz sometimes it's good to do a side by side. If you take the language that a group uses for this group and apply it here, how does it sound? And you notice how dehumanizing it is. Employment opportunities with trans folks, how is it getting a job? Is it much harder?
It is way harder.
Yes, tell
I
me
know
about that,
so many.
please.
I know so many trans folk who unfortunately have been completely screwed over by the job market. Folks who used to get
Mm,
like a call back from me like one every three CV sent in, with one in every four, and that number going down to like 1 in 100
mm.
if public knowledge about them being trans is available online. There are cases where like I know so many trans people who just because they're seen as trans, they're just completely unhireable, especially in certain fields where it's just impossible for them to get a job, in a way that is very dissimilar to how it is for I would say the rest of the rainbow today, but it's very much, more similar to how it used to be for them 40 years ago. So we're very much seeing how the community here just ends up being completely unable to access so many kinds of jobs. I'm
Mm.
saying in particular for trans women and other people considered as trans feminine by society. It's why
It is
poverty runs rampant. It's
it is
why,
specifically trans women who have the hardest time.
absolutely, there's a reason why
Interesting.
trans women are disproportionately involved in both like the arts as well as like in sex work. It's because they have no other choice oftentimes.
Mm.
There's this historical saying which goes, if you're trans, you're probably either a community worker, an artist, or a sex worker. One of the three. And I
Damn.
mean, it's good that it's no longer the case, but I mean, in many ways, it still is.
And is it even harder if you are a trans woman who is not white?
Absolutely, it is
Mm.
way. It is even harder.
Man, that's
It's
really
also why
rough.
you see so many trans folk being forced to create their own businesses or create their own initiatives in order to survive. It's because nothing else works for them.
How can we in Canada support the global trans community?
I'll say, there's a lot we can do. But I'd say one of the things we can do, of course, is, make sure we're able to welcome our arms to like anyone who is unable to access any forms of, for example, trans healthcare, etc. Like, we ought to give them like space that folks need, a place where they're safe, can migrate over here and like benefit from like a safer space to be a queer trans person.
Mm-hmm.
We could also, of course, support in so many other ways by refusing to allow, for example, regimes which criminalize or kill trans and queer people to actually, be able to have anything. I mean, that is something you can do. We can put pressure on others for sure. But I mean, once again, it's important not to get at the same time the very same British colonial origins of a lot of countries anti-trans, contemporary anti-trans and anti-queer policies today. So it's very important that we do not forget that and do not, just pretend that this is like, a question of like quote unquote Western countries being better. Because in fact, Western countries on this end are worse. And nowadays, I'll say it, even if we can lend support on this end, it's important that we don't do so in a way which seeks to, quote unquote further colonize folks, because that is what a lot of folks see
Mm.
nowadays whenever we try to teach about inclusion, which is understandable.
How do we in the trans community, let's levy some criticism at ourselves. How do we become more intersectional?
I'd say it's the most important thing is to listen, actually be open to things, and to actually listen to others. Because right now we're just still pretending that all is all right, you know? And we cannot just keep on doing that. We gotta actually, properly start listening to people who are affected, listening to them and learning from them, etc. That's something which everyone can do. I'm kind of surprised that we aren't doing so yet, you know?
What would you give for advice for someone who's young and transgender? How do they start their journey? How do they find support? What advice would you provide for them?
I'd say the big one would actually just be, to believe in yourself and to actually, not just summarily dismiss your ability to thrive despite the fact that the road is a pretty bad place.
Yeah. Yeah, and seek community that supports you. If because a lot of families don't still, but seek that community. There's people.
Oh,
There's people who support you.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's the most important thing, I think, like having the people around you to support you. Yeah, and is there anything else you want to close with before we finish up the interview? Anything else that you wanted to say?
Honestly, no. And I would say it is a scary time to be a trans person in this road, but it absolutely remains that we can help create a better road together. It remains possible. Yep, we gotta keep on fighting. We always gotta keep on fighting because that's what it takes.
I strongly disagreed with Celeste on certain issues. I take a very optimistic view of trans right. We will suffer pushback, but personally I believe that we are flourishing and we will flourish. I don't believe that we will one day produce refugees in Canada, but that Canada will probably be a country that is wildly open to trans people from around the globe. I think we will be a bastion for the future of LGBTQ rights, and I believe that we are already en route to doing that. With that being said, I appreciated Celeste's time, and I hope that together all of us will find hope. Thank you so much for listening to the Rover podcast, The Midnight Choir, and I hope that you will subscribe to our newsletter below. I hope that you will hit that like, subscribe button, go check out therover.ca/newsletter, therover.ca/support-us, and I hope you will enjoy everything that we are doing over there. We do deep investigative journalism into a wide variety of topics. Thank you so much, and I will see you next week.